Bonjour tout le monde, welcome everyone. My name is Michael Sinatra, je suis le directeur du centre de recherche interuniversitaire sur les humanités numériques basé à l'Université de Montréal en collaboration avec McGill University et nous sommes un regroupement stratégique du FRQSC. And it's my great pleasure this morning to welcome Manuel Burghardt from Leipzig University for one of two talks. This morning up the mountain and on Thursday at McGill. Both talks are on the website of the center. Manuel is a professor for computational humanities at the Institute for Computer Science at the University of Leipzig, where he's responsible for the bachelor's and master's program in digital humanities and serves as a speaker of the Forum of Digital Humanities in Leipzig. He also heads the digital lab at Research Center Global Dynamics, the ReCen Globe, and his research combines computational methods and cultural analysis with extensive experience with third-party funded projects on a wide range of topics. And this morning, we're very delighted to hear him talk about tracing the Kafkaesque.
Thank you so much, Michael. Bonjour tout le monde. I think that's about all the French I can offer. I mean, I had a couple of years of French back in school, and I was really excited how much I'm able to understand. So be careful what you say, but my communication skills are kind of... Okay, so thank you, Michael, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to the center. What I'll present today is essentially a collection of experiments we've been working on over the past month. And the original goal was fairly simple, to see whether digital humanities methods can help us learn something new about Kafka's unique writing style, or if you want, the Kafkaesque. I'm not sure where you guys are all coming from, if you're all Kafka experts or literary scholars. You've heard of Kafka? Okay, that should be enough. Okay, yeah, along the way of these experiments, the project turned out into a bit of a methodological and also epistemological journey, and you'll see what I mean in just a bit. Okay, let me start with a very brief introduction, just to make sure we are all roughly on the same page in terms of Kafka. Franz Kafka lived from 1883 to 1924 and spent most of his rather short life in Prague, a city that was undergoing major transformations at the beginning of the 20th century. So the consequences of industrialization and shifting political identities created a sense of rapid change. And with this rapid change, there also grew a feeling of uncertainty. And many writers of Kafka's generation, for example, James Joyce, but also other German-speaking authors like Arthur Schnitzler or Robert Musil, experimented with new literary forms in response to these changes, which are typically summarized as literary modernism. Kafka clearly belongs to this modernist context, but his writings still stands out as particularly distinctive because his prose is often extremely clear and precise, almost bureaucratic in tone, while the situations he describes are deeply strange and unsettling. And in Kafka's stories, characters frequently encounter opaque authorities or systems they cannot really understand or escape. And because this style is so recognizable, Kafka's name eventually became an adjective describing absurd and oftentimes bewildering, intransparent situations. I guess it's almost a cliche to say that Kafka is one of the most studied authors in German literature, and the scale of Kafka scholarship is really remarkable. So, for example, if you just look at this rather well-known annotated bibliography in 3 volumes, which covers research on Kafka from 1908 to 1980, this already fills several hundred pages, right? And it stopped in the 80s. And research has, of course, continued ever since. So if these days you search for Franz Kafka on Google Scholar, you get around 180,000 results. So given this enormous amount of scholarship, one might expect that digital humanities methods, things like natural language processing or text mining or distant reading, as it is often called, have also been widely applied to Kafka. And actually, well, I wouldn't say they have been widely applied, but there are some interesting studies using digital humanities methods on Kafka. And if you look at those, so I try to highlight the important bits in the titles, they all have the keywords stylistics or stylometry in their title. And actually, most of the computational research on Kafka is really in the field of stylometry or computational stylistics. So not sure how deep you are in the method of stylometry or digital stylistics, I decided to include one introductory slide. If it's all known to you, just let me know, then I can speed it up. So very briefly explain, stylometry is the basic idea that every author has a distinctive writing style, and that this style can be captured using measurable features, right? So such as the most frequent words an author uses, or a certain preference for certain parts of speech or grammatical constructions, syntactic constructions. And from these features, we can then build what is often called a stylistic fingerprint. And we can create such fingerprints for different authors and then compare these fingerprints by means of mathematical similarity measures like the cosine distance. And this allows us to measure whether the style of one author is similar or rather different from that of another author. So what you typically do in stylometry is you create these fingerprints for a bunch of authors, for a bunch of texts from different authors. And what you see here in this example is a similarity comparison of texts from different authors based on their 400 most frequent words. So you build a corpus of different texts from different authors. You calculate what are the most 400 frequent words these authors use, and then you build fingerprints based on these frequent words. A very basic, also questionable approach, but this is like a standard first thing you try in stylometry. To make the visualization easier to read, texts by the same author are shown in the same color. So you see here, K stands for Kafka. We have a couple of Kafka texts, a couple of Jean-Paul texts, a couple of Schiller texts. And if two texts share many of these words, of these features, they appear closer together in this visualization space. And you can immediately see that the method works reasonably well because texts by the same author tend to cluster in terms of similarity. So if they are closer together, they form clusters, which I think makes a lot of sense intuitively, right? Because authors usually don't change their style randomly from one text to another text. They are pretty consistent in their style. What is interesting here is that Kafka's texts form a cluster that is that hardly overlaps with any of the other authors. So all these are Kafka texts. They are two colors because these here above are actually Kafka's literary writings, and below are Kafka's letters, which are different text types, but still have many similarities in language because you see stylistically they are closely together. However, the other authors are further away, and they also sometimes overlap, right? So they are not as clearly distinguished as Kafka. So for example, Goethe, Schiller, Heine, Jean-Paul, they show a much stronger stylistic overlap. Which is to be expected, honestly, right? Because, I mean, they are from a totally different time, and, I mean, it is to be expected that they are stylistically different to Kafka. So this is really just to show you how stylometry basically works. The example itself is rather trivial. However, there are quite a number of existing studies that I just showed you before that use stylometry in less trivial ways to investigate what makes Kafka's style so distinctive. For reasons of time, I won't discuss all of these papers in detail. And to be honest, that's not really necessary, I guess, because in the end, they usually arrive at very similar findings. What they do is they can identify measurable differences on the linguistic level, first and foremost. For example, this very recent paper here on the right, it's from last year, compares Kafka to Thomas Mann and arrives at the following main differences here in the conclusion. Our analysis reveals that the main stylistic difference lies in their use of parts of speech, with Kafka showing a preference for adverbs and Mann favoring adjectives. In terms of linguistic complexity and diversity, Mann's language exhibits greater diversity, while Kafka's language is relatively lower in complexity. All right. I mean, this is interesting, but this is not like groundbreaking novel insight, right? I guess similar things have been described in qualitative hermeneutic approaches to Kafka already. So it's more of a validation, I would say. And this is honestly the reason why I didn't pursue the road of stylometry further, trying to like really understand what the unique Kafkaesque feature is that is going on in Kafka. So yeah, it doesn't really help us to understand the Kafkaesque reading experience, right? And I think experience is probably the magic word here, because after looking at the results of these stylometric studies, I came across a very different publication that became quite important for how this project further developed. And this publication, apologies for, I will be quoting one or two German sources because, well, I'm from Germany, and Germans tend to analyze Kafka even more than other people. And this one is by Frieda Krauss, a dissertation. And Frieda Krauss argues that the Kafkaesque is primarily a phenomenon of reception. So reception theory might be the key to get a better grasp of what is going on, what makes Kafka such a unique reading experience. The Kafkaesque, that's how Krauss describes it, does not simply exist in the text itself. Rather, it emerges as a subjective individual phenomenon during the reading process. And Krauss supports this argument by drawing on reception theory, which some of you might be aware of. So the basic idea in reception theory is that texts do not simply contain meaning by itself, but that readers actively produce meaning while reading. Krauss draws particular attention to the work of Roman Ingarden and Wolfgang Iser, who describe literary texts as containing, in German, Unbestimmtheitsstellen, places of indeterminacy, and also Leerstellen, so empty positions, blanks, if you want. And these are moments where information is deliberately left unspecified by the author. Reception theory assumes that readers are intended to fill these gaps through their own interpretation and imagination. And in the case of Kafka, this leads to a simple but very important price question. How much indeterminacy can one expect the reader to tolerate? Well, see for yourselves. Is there something wrong with me, or is it a universal experience to struggle with reading the trial? Asked a frustrated reader on Reddit. And you find many such instances of people on the social web, right? So it illustrates that readers seem to be generally struggling with reading Kafka. So it might even be a central characteristic of Kafka's writing. Many of his texts operate through what you could call a dialectic of provoking interpretation, but at the same time resisting interpretation. Or as Theodor Adorno famously wrote, every sentence in Kafka says, interpret me, and none of them will tolerate it. So let's have a look at a direct example. I believe most of you have heard of the Metamorphosis, die Verwandlung in German, and we can see this clearly in this text. Because it starts right in the beginning with the main character, Gregor Samsa, waking up and being transformed into a giant insect. And obviously, readers immediately try to interpret this event, try to find an answer for what has happened to poor Gregor. But the text itself, you keep on reading and things happen, but it never provides an explanation of why he turned into an insect. It doesn't even attempt to. Right? So this is a perfect example for Kafka provoking interpretation and at the same time refusing to resolve it. Because, so in the very beginning, Gregor asks, what's happened to me? But never again in the text does anybody question what has happened. It has just happened, and it's, it has many negative implications for him and his family, but nobody really questions why it has happened. So let's take a short break here. If the Kafkaesque emerges largely from what is left unsaid in gaps Kafka has left, from missing information, then this poses a very interesting challenge for the digital humanities. You know, I'm a professor of computational humanities. I like to use computational methods for making sense of texts. But how can we actually measure something computationally using text mining if it is not actually present in the text, if there's nothing to mine from the text? And at first glance, this almost sounds like a perfect example of a problem where digital methods might might just not have much to offer for literary scholars, right? Where traditional close reading and hermeneutics might just seem much more appropriate. I mean, totally feasible. I'm not saying that digital humanities has better methods or can improve all areas of humanities or literary scholarship. But behold, for there is another perspective on reception studies, and another German author who introduced the notion of reception studies as a kind of empirical literary studies in the 1970s. So what was suggested here was that instead of analyzing the text, they try to measure reader responses empirically. And the idea was very simple. So the idea of empirical reception studies is to ask readers how they experience the text. For example, through well-known methods like questionnaires, semantic scales, or reader surveys. So in theory, this sounds very promising, I think, but in practice, these studies face very familiar problems of any empirical research or empirical research methods. For example, how to find enough participants, right? So who wants to share his or her reading experience with Kafka in an honest way? How to deal with biases, and most importantly, how to create an authentic reading situation and elucidate authentic reactions, right? How to make sure people actually tell you what they really felt or what they really liked or disliked about the text. Okay, I think there might be a solution to this problem. In the age of the social web, often referred to as Web 2.0, people voluntarily share their opinions about almost everything online, also about their reading experiences, right? We just saw one on Reddit, which I read out earlier. And I wonder, could this perhaps open up new possibilities for what we might call empirical reception studies 2.0? Well, I would say definitely yes, because platforms like, for example, Goodreads allow millions of readers to document their reading experiences. And in many ways, these reviews, this is very interesting, resemble what you might know from the methods catalog as a diary study, right? Where people are asked to write down in a regular fashion their experiences about a certain subject. So what people do here on a voluntary basis is actually a classical method in empirical research and in reception research. The difference is simply that people do this voluntarily and hopefully with less biases. Here's one example. Goodreads user Miranda read The Metamorphosis and is pretty clear that she didn't quite like it. But the more interesting part is her explanation. I highlighted the most important part because she writes that she generally dislikes books where things just happen without explanation, and that she also didn't like the feel of consistent dreary and consistently weird feeling. And that is actually a perfect summary of the Kafka reading experience, I would say, right? So she dislikes the gaps, and she also dislikes the atmosphere these gaps create, right? And this is actually the point where digital humanities text mining methods become very useful again, because Miranda isn't the only one who wrote about The Metamorphosis. You see, we have 72,000 reviews only on this Kafka text, right? So there's a huge amount. So this should be a huge resource or source for actually, getting our hands on user-generated reviews or on reception experiences. So naturally, being computational humanities people, we decided to build a corpus of Goodreads reviews, which is fairly simple. So we started with 14 Kafka works, which include well-known texts like The Metamorphosis, The Trial, The Castle, but also lesser-known works, even his letters and diaries. So because I could imagine that reviews are pretty different from like the mainstream hit Metamorphosis to the more specific titles, like for example, Country Doctor or The Burrow, which not everybody has to read at school, but does it maybe on a voluntary choice. Okay, so the reviews come from many different languages, but English clearly dominates. And the corpus we gathered for our first experiments has around 8.5 million tokens. And what I will show you next are some first explorations and some first observations. Maybe think of them as first sanity checks for the question, can we actually extract meaningful reception patterns from this material, right? So is it even worth to invest time and methods into this corpus? And this is also relevant from a perspective of eco-critical use, right? I will be talking about this on Thursday in more detail, because I think we should always first use some lightweight methods which don't involve a lot of compute power to explore large corpora like this and see if they really do what we intend them to do, if there is really something there before we are firing a lot of computer power with all kinds of fancy large language models on them, just to find out that in the end it didn't really work. So that's the main reason for this rather simplistic first methods I will show you, because the very first step was really just to look at the most frequent words. So this is something you could easily do with tools like Voyant tools, right? But this already revealed some really interesting things, because many of the highly frequent words obviously reflect personal emotional reactions or what might be called experience narratives. So very often people write, I felt, my experience was emotional, disturbing, relatable, haunting, also funny. So these are words that indicate that people are actually describing their reading experience. And secondly, we also have many evaluative terms like good, great, boring, loved, hated. And I think especially the combination of both, like describing a personal reading experience and also providing an evaluation, should be really interesting in analyzing, because I think the interplay of experience and evaluation is really interesting. So, for example, did readers who felt depressed and had a negative reading experience, can they still evaluate the text as a great read or even a literary masterpiece? Or do negative reading experiences automatically translate into negative evaluations? Okay, another observation concerns what we might call interpretative labor. And in many reviews, readers explicitly perform acts of interpretation. Very interesting from a reception point of view. We see many words that signal this process, such as think, understand, meaning, metaphor, etc. And at the same time, we find a large number of epistemic hedges, so linguistic devices typically used to express uncertainty, like maybe, perhaps, seems, maybe Kafka is trying to say. And together, these markers form a pattern that could be described as, I'm not sure if this term actually exists, public hermeneutics, right? So people trying to make sense of the text in a public social reading setting. So in other words, reviewers are not simply reporting their reading experience, but they are actively negotiating possible interpretations in front of an imagined audience, which should be really interesting for empirical reception studies. A third and last observation concerns Kafka's position within the literary canon. We frequently see words such as classic, literature, school, teacher, or required reading. So this suggests that many readers encounter Kafka in an institutional reading context. Not sure, would Kafka be part of the canon in Canada as well? Maybe. It surely is in Germany. So yeah, and I think that matters a lot because reading a book voluntarily is a very different setting from reading a book because it is assigned in school, right? And it should also affect your reviewing and reading experience. So we might be able to model at least two very different reception contexts. First, voluntary leisure reading, where readers choose to read Kafka themselves. And second, institutionally prescribed reading, such as in school or university contexts. And you could imagine that in these contexts, words like boring or things like that might appear more often. Okay, so these observations are for me very promising signs that it makes sense to actually use this corpus for more detailed empirical reception experiments. We then extended this basic keyword analysis using another standard tool from the Digital Humanities Toolbox, which is topic modeling. Most of you have probably heard of this approach at some point. In very simple terms, topic modeling identifies recurring themes, topics within a large collection of documents. And a topic is essentially a group of words that tend to co-occur frequently across many documents. A document in our case would be a review, right? And if words tend to co-occur in many reviews, they will be clustered to something we then call a topic. Most of the topics, so what we did here, we built an LDA topic model for 42,000 Goodreads reviews in English language for Metamorphosis. And we identified a total of 40 topics. And I won't go into the details because actually many topics show pretty similar things we just observed from the keyword analysis, right? So this is redundant, but I really want to zoom in the most frequent topic, so topic 1, which has another aspect which we haven't mentioned so far. And it heavily revolves, so you see the single words of the topic right here. Not sure if you can read them. And this topic heavily revolves around what you might call family dynamics or family dynamics and financial obligations or financial dependency. So we see words such as parents, mother, son, Grete, which is the sister of Gregor, but also his occupation. He was a salesman, provide and money. So he provided money for his family. And this is really interesting from a reception perspective because this suggests that many readers on Goodreads interpret the story primarily as a family drama centered around economic obligation rather than a purely philosophical or existential literature. So this is just one example here of one of the reviews. We have all felt like Gregor Samsa at some point. Kafka reveals the horrific concept of never having belonged to the family we were born into. After that rejection, what is left? So very dramatical, but a very frequent type of analysis. And yeah, I think at this point, the source to use or the corpus of Goodreads reviews is even more justified to be used for interesting empirical studies. So on my journey to understand the very essence of the Kafkaesque, I started to investigate in this corpus how readers actually use the word Kafkaesque itself. And in the reviews for the Metamorphosis alone, we found more than 700 occurrences of the word Kafkaesque. And what you see here are just some examples that all do a similar thing, a very common type of usage pattern, I would say. And if we simply look at the words that co-appear with the word Kafkaesque, so I highlighted them in yellow here, we see that they establish a bit of a semantic field around the term Kafkaesque, which is actually known from the literary discourse, right? So this is actually how Kafkaesque is described in literary dictionaries or how it is taught in school. Recurring elements that refer to bureaucratic absurdity, alienation, insecurity, existential dread, dehumanization, or that generates the general experience of feeling strange, surreal, dark, delicate, bizarre, frightening, or nightmarish. So this is basically the usage of the word Kafkaesque as is meant to be. But interestingly, we also find many other cases where of how the word Kafkaesque is used. For example, look at these 5 examples here. So here, readers appear to be somewhat unsure how to exactly use the word. So they are aware of the word, but they're not quite confident how to use it. I finally understand what Kafkaesque means after reading this novella. So one pattern here might be that after reading the Metamorphosis, many reviewers now know and explicitly state that they finally understand what the term means. And some go even further and say that they now feel confident enough to use the words themselves in a conversation. So this is really interesting in the sense, in this sense, familiarity with the term seems to function almost like a form of cultural capital in the Bourdieu sense, right? So knowing and using the word Kafkaesque in these cases seems to become a way of displaying some kind of intellectual habitus, or it's used as intellectual posing almost. Well, and finally, we find many examples like this. So it's nothing like the two previous usage patterns, using Kafkaesque as it is meant to be, or being keen about finally understanding what Kafkaesque means, but really just using it a bit out of context, I guess. Guy becomes bug, very Kafkaesque. So here the term is reduced to its minimum, to a very simplistic formula, right? So metamorphosis equals guy becomes a bug equals Kafkaesque or Kafka. So we see a strong semantic reduction of the concept. And here it is where it became really interesting for me, because here I took a detour that I hadn't expected beforehand. And it is really interesting to observe here that the literary phenomenon becomes condensed into a kind of shorthand, which is also visible in many Kafka-related memes circulating online, right? So something very interesting seems to be happening here. The term Kafkaesque, and even the author Kafka himself, appear to have gained some kind of independent life within digital culture, partly detached from its original literary meaning. So this phenomenon has also been described in the work of Frida Krauss, whom I mentioned earlier, and Krauss introduces the term pop Kafkaesque to distinguish these pop cultural meanings from the traditional literary concept. So what exactly does he mean by this? One example often mentioned in this context comes from the TV series Breaking Bad. In one episode titled Kafkaesque, one of the main characters, Jesse, attends a meeting in his rehab group. And during the meeting, he complains about his work situation and his boss in particular. And the group leader, obviously unsure how to respond, labels Jesse's situation as somewhat Kafkaesque. And Jesse, who clearly doesn't fully understand the term, simply repeats and says, yeah, totally Kafkaesque, actually. So in a way, this scene captures the very essence of the pop Kafkaesque, I think, right? Because since then, we seem to be witnessing a flood of out-of-context uses of the word Kafkaesque. So maybe also before, but I think this Breaking Bad situation is maybe a milestone. And there even is a website that documents many of these examples. It is called A Kafkaesque List of Things Described as Kafkaesque. So at this point, we finally have a name for something we already observed to some extent in the Goodreads reviews, and which we have to keep an eye on when we want to do reception studies on this corpus. And probably I just should have gone back to my Goodreads corpus, but eager to learn more about the pop Kafkaesque, I fell into a bit of a personal rabbit hole. So yeah, TikTok, obviously. I mean, I knew TikTok before, theoretically, but I never got so close to it. So TikTok, more specifically BookTok, which you may have heard of. BookTok is a community on TikTok dedicated to sharing enthusiasm for books, one could say. And young readers use it to present their favorite titles, rank books, even stage scenes from their favorite novels, and generally just exchange recommendations in virtual book clubs. And the hashtag BookTok has become an enormous phenomenon and is part of a larger development called social reading. And when I first encountered this, I thought, great, this could provide even more material for empirical reception studies, because 70,000 reviews for Metamorphosis are not enough. And actually, this assumption was kind of reinforced by several newspaper articles claiming that Gen Z is rediscovering Kafka through TikTok. They fell in love with the author, a renaissance of Kafka on TikTok, blah, blah, blah. And some of these articles even cite quite spectacular numbers, claiming that the hashtag Kafka appears several million times on TikTok. And naturally, such numbers make me curious. And so what we did is we built a small TikTok corpus because it's not easy to get your hands on TikTok data. And at first, so this is really just a keyword search for Kafka, and it appears a decent amount, so 15,000 matches. So yeah, it seems to make sense. It actually appears quite often. However, I also noticed that another hashtag, which I had never heard of before, appeared almost just as frequently. And this is the moment when I discovered the video game Honkai Star Rail. Not sure if you have heard about it or if you know it. Yeah, so the game is extremely popular on TikTok and also among my students. And it includes a character named Kafka, who appears in many posts and very often in the context of cosplay or gameplay videos. So from this cosplay scenes here, you can see already that there seems to be no explicit reference between this character and the author Kafka, right? And probably at this point, I should have simply closed the door and returned to the Goodreads data. But curiosity got me, and I wanted to know why characters in video games are now casually named Kafka, or more precisely, whether this is simply a coincidence or whether it reflects an intertextual reference to the literary Kafka. At first glance, the character does not seem to have much in common with Kafka's literary figures, neither visually nor behaviorally. But when me and my students dug a little deeper, we actually found a very explicit reference to the actual Kafka in the prequel game, which is called Honkai Impact, where the character Kafka already appears. And in this game, there are various pieces of equipment which grant the character additional abilities. And a particular set of equipment is called the Loner of Prague. So very promising already. And the three individual items in this set are called after Kafka texts. They are called Betrachtung, contemplation, das Schloss, the castle, and der Prozess, the trial, right? And the items themselves also contain visual references to Kafka's life and works. One of them, for example, depicts a chaotic desk with manuscripts alongside miniature figures of a beetle and a castle. So very clear references to the metamorphosis and the castle. And the reason why I think this example is so revealing is that it shows the evolution of the Kafkaesque into the pop Kafkaesque, or in this case of Kafka into pop Kafka, in a nutshell. In the first part of the game, so here, there was a clear context, a clear reference to Kafka and his works. In the second part, the game character named Kafka still exists, but without the explicit context. And thus it begins alive on its own, as we just saw on TikTok. Apropos TikTok, let's very briefly return to book talk, because beyond the Honkai Star Rail references, there are actually many interesting Kafka references circulating there. On the one hand, these are often, well, just visual references to specific works, most commonly the Metamorphosis. So typically people dressing up as bugs, alone or in groups. But there are also other interesting things happening. There are also references to Kafka's letters, especially his love letters. And these are often heavily romanticized. And Kafka himself is sometimes portrayed as an, well, idealized heartthrob or thirst meme. And this is really wild and ironic. I'm not sure if you've ever read into the biography of Kafka and his relation to women and his love letters to women. So this is even absurd, right? Because if you take a closer look at Kafka's actual love life and his relationships, well, it was very complicated, to say the least. So really interesting. And if you look a little further, things become even more absurd. So in some cases, Kafka, either as a bug or as himself, is inserted into existing TikTok dance memes. So typically, all of these memes have in common, you see a bug or Kafka standing in Gregor Samsa's room, and then they are animated with AI and make Kafka or the bug dance to whatever song happens to be trending on TikTok at the moment. And to what extent Kafka as an author is actually known or relevant in these contexts is really the question to me. At this point, the concept of Kafka seems to have taken on a life of its very own, and one might even stretch the notion of the pop Kafkaesque a bit further and and ask whether we may have entered the era of the post-Kafkaesque or post-Kafka, right? So, yeah. I think this is enough. So I think maybe let's stop here and take a breather and digest everything we just saw. And I think at this point, I will also close the talk with a few Betrachtungen, contemplations of my own, so some final reflections, if you will. So if I were to formulate one methodological and also epistemological lesson from this project, it would be that I may have started with one object and ended up with a totally different object, although they are closely related, I guess. I began by asking whether computational methods could capture Kafka's unique style, so computational methods like stylometry. But I found that stylometry is really much better at measuring textual regularities than explaining what readers actually experience as Kafkaesque. And it became very apparent that the Kafkaesque may not be reducible to style in this narrow sense, but it may rather be understood as a readerly effect that emerges from specific narrative structures as described in reception theory. So in a way, the initial project shifted from computational stylistics to computational reception analysis or empirical reception studies, as I called it before. And although I believe reader reviews are a fascinating resource for empirical reception studies, I'm not claiming that we can finally define the Kafkaesque once and for all. What we can rather observe is how readers actually use the concept, which is pretty interesting in its own right, I think. So we can observe how they attach meaning to the Kafkaesque, how they negotiate interpretations, and sometimes how they simplify and instrumentalize it. From the perspective of reception studies, I think this is already quite valuable because it gives us access to reader practices on a scale that would otherwise be very difficult to study. And for me, the most interesting discovery as part of the empirical reception studies approach was to show how rather canonic conceptions of Kafka, his texts, and also the Kafkaesque seem to be slowly transitioning in online media cultures into a very own thing. And one could maybe say that we are observing some kind of conceptual drift from literary reception to meme culture, from interpretation to mere name circulation. And I think this is very fascinating to watch, as it illustrates how a canonical author gradually becomes a somewhat mobile cultural reference in digital culture. I'm now very excited on your perspective on all of this. And before we head straight into the Q&A part, I just would like to give credit to all my lovely Kafka collaborators in Leipzig, and of course also to the students of my seminars. So I did 2 dedicated seminars on the topic who provided great ideas and also thought-provoking discussions on the topic. And I hope we can continue these discussions right now. And thank you for your attention.